All right. Well, we're back talking about another situational judgment test, which is the AAMC preview. And the preview was the what came after the Casper came along. The Casper came along and started to be used widely in medical school admissions, and the preview just took the AAMC longer to launch it. And so as a result, all of the perceptions of the preview exist in relationship to the Casper. So it's funny because when the Casper came out, I was like, oh man, another thing that pre-meds have to jump through in order to get into med school. How annoying this all is. But when I look at the preview, it's even more ridiculous. So the things that I respect about the Casper are it's flexible. So because you are grading answers in relationship to each other and as a cohort, you can be a little bit more flexible and situation specific about how you give a grade. Whereas what they did for the preview was they asked a bunch of med school professors what they would do in these situations and what they would rate as effective and not effective. And so what's interesting is you can see some of those patterns in the answers that they have. You're not just asking what's right and wrong. You're asking what would a med school professor do? So that's what the preview is assessing. And the patterns on the preview are even more apparent than they are on the Casper. So what I want to do is just give the essential strategies that I've noticed that will help you decode the preview because it is very encoded. So I'm going to share my screen here. And I want to just start by talking about the themes of the preview. The preview has certain scenario patterns. So some of these are going to mirror the Casper. So ethical dilemmas and integrity issues is the first one that we have listed here, like cheating or privacy violations or protocol breaches. There's teamwork and collaboration conflicts. And we'll make this table available wherever we post this for you to take a look at. Responsibility versus personal priorities, so scheduling conflicts, competing commitments, etc. Academic challenges and feedback, so poor performance of you or a classmate, critical feedback, learning struggles, cultural or interpersonal sensitivity, bias, insensitive remarks, cultural accommodation, professionalism in public, representing the school well, handling authority in public behavior, or the one we're going to focus on for today is empathy in patient/peer interactions. So empathy, it's attached to a relevant competency. This is what the AAMC's competencies look like. We're going to talk about what an effective response looks like and what an ineffective response looks like. So this is attached to empathy and compassion, interpersonal skills, and teamwork and collaboration. Now, who cares? But the AAMC, when they write these questions, are deliberately looking at, okay, which one are we testing in this scenario? And they want each preview to test all the different competencies in rough balance so that they can say that, oh, okay, your score on this preview equates to other people's scores on other previews. So the good traits are the kinds of things you'd expect, like balancing compassion with practical constraints, making time for emotional needs, validating the feelings of other people. I mean, these are some of these are characteristics I didn't learn until much later in life, like into my 30s. So it'd be nice if future doctors already had this stuff nailed, and they didn't have to learn these the hard way. Not sure all doctors do have these qualities, but it's a work in progress. So finding resources to help, following up on concerns. It's bad to dismiss emotional concerns as unimportant. It's bad to respond with impatience or condescension. So it's really a question of recognizing what kind of scenario we're in and what the dominant response needs to be. So if it's an empathy situation, you need to be empathetic and you need to make sure that you're not dismissive. So let's take a look at what a practice scenario looks like. Now, this is a scenario that we have spiraled from a preview question. So this is not an actual preview question, but it mirrors a preview question. So you'll immediately notice you have to choose whether each of these solutions are anywhere from very ineffective to very effective. You have four choices: very ineffective, ineffective, effective, or very effective. And in their answer choices, the preview writers explain why it's one of these and not the others. So why is it very ineffective versus very effective? All right, so our practice scenario goes like the following. You are in an anatomy lab working with 3 other students. One student in your group is consistently finishing their portion of the dissection much faster than everyone else, but with less attention to detail, which is impacting the quality of specimens for the group's learning. Please rate the effectiveness of each response to this situation. So, Ryan, I'm going to illustrate our technique here, which is the first thing we want to figure out is what is the A, but also B. There's generally 2 competing problems here in any preview scenario. how would you articulate A, but also B?
I mean, potentially efficiency versus precision in a sense.
Okay.
I think maybe even like efficiency versus fairness. There is this pressure to get something done on time and quickly. And it doesn't help if all lab mates are working at a very slow pace.
Mm.
But it is kind of the needs of the many is more important than the needs of the few in a sense, because this person may have their particular working style, but it's affecting the larger group. And so I think efficiency versus fairness is probably what I would bring up the most.
Perfect. So I like to do this before you look at the answer choices themselves, because they're going to lead you down specific rabbit holes, and it's going to start to bias your sense of what you're looking for in a very effective solution. So in your head, once you read these sample situations, try to think about A, but also B. What's the tension? Because there's always a tension. And so I like your phrasing of that. Hopefully that process gets you down to just a few seconds as you're going through this, because you have a lot of questions on the preview to get through. You have an hour, and I think it's something like 60 scenarios. So you got to move. What the second question before you look at the answers is, what would you be looking for in a possible solution here?
Oh, the most effective compromise. I know that sounds reductive, but
Yeah.
like you'll see as we go through these, you'll see a lot of options where there's a clear insensitivity or there's a clear desire to almost foist the responsibility onto someone else. We'll get into it, but the most ineffective responses are the ones where you want to just like tell the person to sort of change or be better or figure it out, or ones where you just say, hey, I don't want to deal with this, so I'm going to have somebody else deal with it. Those are always very ineffective because they're not actually leading towards compromise. They're leading towards one person having to either bear all of the burden or make all of the changes.
Okay, so and let's actually zoom in just a little bit so we can get like one answer choice at a time here on our screen. So we're gonna go. We're gonna start with the answer here at the top. And when I'm reading a question, there's a two-part sorting for me. One is, does this solve the problem in a productive way? If it does, it's either effective or very effective. If it doesn't, it's either ineffective or very ineffective. So tell the student they need to slow down and be more careful with their work. Does this solve the problem?
Yeah, no.
Okay, so it's ineffective or very ineffective, and the question here is really, does it make the problem much worse? So if it does make the problem much worse, it's very ineffective. If it is only somewhat, we can call it just ineffective, not very.
Yeah, it's a little hard to say. I think that's one of my issues with the preview is that I think there's like such a fine line between the very ineffective and the
Mhm.
effective, very effective. Like those very distinctions are gray to me.
Yep.
Because you can imagine a scenario where you do tell someone they need to slow down and be more careful, and they're like, "Oh yeah, you're right," and then the problem solves itself. But most of the time, that's not what's going to happen. So I would probably just say ineffective.
Okay. Let's try the next one. Ask the professor to reassign the student to a different group.
That's very ineffective.
Why?
Um, just because, like I said, whenever the solution is foisting the problem onto another person, that's pretty ineffective. Because, I mean, it'd be one thing if the person had broken all kinds of policies, campus rules, laws, and you told the professor about it. But this is just being a tattletale and not even trying to solve the problem. You just immediately run to the higher authority, and it's definitely, as you said, I think going to make the problem worse.
Okay. Suggest the group establish quality standards and review each other's work before proceeding.
Yeah, it has the potential to solve the problem. So I think I
Mhm.
might say effective.
Okay. Um, Next one is privately ask the student if they would be willing to demonstrate their technique so you can learn to work more efficiently.
That does not seem to be effective at all because the prompt has told us that the actual problem is their highly efficient pace is causing the problems. So the problem is not you needing to work faster, it's to avoid problems.
Okay. So would you get that as ineffective or very ineffective?
I'd probably just go ineffective.
All right. And then reassign dissection tasks to give the quick student smaller, less critical areas.
Effective.
All right. So you don't think any of these were very effective?
No.
Okay, that is possible in a preview question, and you don't want to do the whole like, did I do enough A's, B's, C's, and D's kind of thing. Okay, let's take a look at what the answers said. So tell the student they need to slow down and be more careful with their work. Ineffective. So the rationale here, so you got that one correct. The rationale here is, while this directly addresses the issue, the approach is confrontational and focuses on criticism rather than collaboration. Yeah, so if we think back to the what makes a good response here for the empathy situation, making sure that you are compassionate where possible, balancing compassion with practical constraints. All right, second question, ask the professor to reassign the student to a different group. Very ineffective. You are also correct. This response avoids addressing the issue directly and attempts to remove the student rather than working toward a solution. It demonstrates poor teamwork and conflict resolution skills. All right, next one was suggest the group establish quality standards and review each other's work before proceeding. They call this very effective. I think the reason it's very effective is it's non-confrontational. It does not presuppose what the right answer is. It's a suggestion to improve as opposed to a demand. Oh, you've got to be better kind of thing. It applies to everyone, not just the student in question. So this is the kind of thing that medical school professors love. Number 4, privately ask the student if they would be willing to demonstrate their technique so you can learn more efficiently. So the grade here is effective because it tactfully initiates a conversation about technique without direct criticism. It shows respect for the student's efficiency while creating an opportunity to observe and potentially suggest improvements. It doesn't directly, though, affect the quality concerns affecting the group's specimens. So they give it effective because of its tact, and but don't give it very effective because it doesn't explicitly address the other side of the equation. So I think you got a little bit focused on one side of the equation rather than the other. And then reassign the dissection tasks to give this quick student smaller, less critical areas. They call this ineffective because it attempts to minimize the impact of the student's work, but it doesn't address the underlying issue or help the student improve.
I knew I was going to get some wrong. So I'm not surprised. And it's really these last two that are just sort of like flipped for me.
Sure.
Yeah. And what's interesting is like the prompt doesn't say definitively that the student is definitely wrong with the work that they're producing. That would be sort of my objection to the question, is like, if it was definitive that this person's efficiency was leading to bad answers and that was a fact, then I don't think it's particularly effective to have them teach you. And if you're trying to get the lab done by maybe the end of the day deadline, it does seem effective to reassign the student the smaller bits. So I'm not as hard on the preview, I think, as you are, Rob. Like I actually kind of think it's better than the Casper, but that's another conversation we can have a separate time. But I think it values, it tries to be objective, which is I think what I like. But then as a result, it loses nuance. I can see exactly why. I almost agree with their justifications, but I was thinking about it slightly differently in a gray area that the prompt doesn't explain. We don't know when it's due. We don't know if you're in the right or if maybe you just think his answers are wrong. I like the objectivity of it, but it's easy to see how getting a 100% based on their rubric is going to be very difficult.
Yeah. Let's take a look at some of these strategies that I've got for this and see how they could have helped maybe in this situation. So we talked about the technique where define the key conflict, A, but also B, and then articulate what a solution would have to do to address the situation. I think that's still helpful to do before you get distracted by the answer choices. But there are some strategies here. And so the first is start to notice the language common in very effective responses. So very effective responses are written a certain way. They love active problem-solving verbs like ask, suggest, offer, discuss, or work with. Again, med school professors, this is the language that they use to get along well in academia. Balance and consideration, while also or both, that kind of language that acknowledges multiple perspectives is part of the very effective responses usually. Private, then public. So responses that handle sensitive matters privately first are consistently rated higher. Accountability, taking responsibility with phrases like acknowledge the mistake or explain your role is generally highly valued. And then specific action plus rationale. The best responses also often combine a clear action with an understanding of why it's important. Explain that patient privacy is essential for maintaining trust. So let's go back and see for the very effective one. Suggest the group establish quality standards and review each other's work before proceeding. There's that key word, the helpful active verb. Okay, so then let's take a look at what the language of very ineffective responses are. So avoidance terminology, words like ignore, skip, hope, or pretend, signal running from problems instead of facing them. I think that was let's see, was that the actual wording of the one where they said ask the professor to reassign the student to a different group? It's not, it doesn't use that specific language, but it does use that idea in this case. Self-centered perspective, phrases focus solely on personal benefit without considering others' needs. So again, in that particular very ineffective solution, you are not solving the problem. You are just focusing on what will help you and the other students. Be careful about extreme language. Anything that suggests dishonesty or sweeping something under the rugs, white lies, that kind of thing, is almost always very ineffective. And then delegation without effort, pushing your responsibility onto others without attempting solutions for yourself, is almost always very ineffective. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the language can help with some of that code and starting to notice patterns in it. So one of the things I suggest as you're practicing for the preview, look hard at the questions you got wrong, like, and especially if you were off by just one answer choice either way, which is the majority of the time, that's what you're off by. Try to say, okay, well, here's what got me, and here's a word that I'm going to try to look for next time. Okay, it's not just about words, of course, it's also about ideas. So generally, if you're trying to figure out the effective versus ineffective, like something that makes it merely effective will address only one part of the problem. So not the whole thing, it'll address one. Maybe it takes a good approach, but it lacks follow through. Maybe it's not as proactive as it could be. Maybe it helps the situation somewhat, but doesn't resolve it completely, or focuses on the symptoms rather than the root causes. So you're looking for things that are helpful, but not perfect.
I think the symptoms versus the root causes is the most important of all of those. Personally, I think that's the most simplest way of thinking about it. That's actually why I got mine wrong, I think. Because I was prioritizing getting the lab finished rather than actually trying to help this guy produce better answers. So, because the root cause was that he wasn't doing it well. So to give him an easier assignment is a symptom and not the root cause, So I think that's a really good way of thinking about it.
Well, and that's another way of phrasing our technique here. So if our technique is to say A, but also B, that is the key conflict or issue is the root cause, right? That's what we're trying to identify on our own before we dive into the answer choices. We won't always be successful with that. And it's a bit of it's a skill, being able to identify those root causes in each situation, but precisely because it involves so much gray area. We've talked about what makes it effective versus not very effective. If we're talking about ineffective versus not very ineffective, generally involves degree. So it misses the core issue, but and addresses a peripheral concern. Maybe it takes action that doesn't harm but doesn't really help. If it's neutral, that's generally going to be just called ineffective. Shows good intentions with poor execution, lacks the timing or approach needed to be truly helpful, or puts unnecessary burden on others when you could handle it yourself. So there's a couple of examples from the AAMC's practice exam about acknowledging a student's comments about a homeless patient, but meeting them with them anyway is rated merely ineffective because it doesn't address the inappropriate bias, but also doesn't make things worse. So if we look at some of the responses of effective and ineffective, let's see if we can chalk them up to some of these bullet points here. So in our situation, tell the student they need to slow down and be more careful with their work was rated ineffective.
Yeah. I think it's because it doesn't really do any harm, but doesn't solve the problem.
Yeah. We said privately ask the student if they would be willing to demonstrate their technique so you can learn to work more efficiently. Seems like that love the privately versus in public. Certainly ask is another good word for effective responses. But it doesn't solve both sides of the problem, does it?
Yeah, that's the sneakiest one. because
Mm.
it's sort of like, I think they're like, it could certainly lead to a solution, but on its own it doesn't. I think, yeah, I think that's the sneakiest one.
Okay.
But yeah, I can see why it's effective, because it does something helpful, but doesn't ultimately solve the problem on its own.
Yeah, that's the thing that the preview is so good at. It just leads to such parsing of hairs in these situations. But um,
Yeah.
there is an underlying logic
Yes.
created by medical school professors. You just have to discern what it is. So that's the key skill here. Which yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny that they're testing to see if you're like-minded to them, in a sense. But if you think about it, it does kind of make some sort of sense that
Mm-hmm.
you're gonna have to fit into a community. You're gonna have to kind of have the same sort of approach to problem solving, maybe the same discourse as what
Mm-hmm.
they would use. And so, but you're right. I think it's expecting this crazy sort of acceleration in emotional maturity.
Yeah.
I think, like, yeah, if I took this when I was 22 or 23 or whatever, my answers would be wildly different than now. Now that I'm pushing 40, so I think, like, it's but maybe that's kind of the point, is that they're expecting you to be above average in your emotional intelligence and your maturity if you want to be a doctor.
Yeah, different schools are using these situational judgment tests in different ways, and it's still the minority of schools that require them. Um,
Mhm.
but the most common way that I've heard when I've talked to admissions officers is they're using it to screen out the very, very lowest scorers and to select for the diamonds in the rough, the very, very high scorers. The lowest scorers, because if they truly don't get this emotional stuff, like me as a young 20-year-old, you're going to be a pain to deal with as a classmate and as a member of the community. On the flip side, if you're truly one of these diamonds in the rough, well, gosh, we really want you to come to our school because you're going to be so lovely to be around and work with. Med schools are small, the classes are small, and one bad apple can really, really spoil the whole bunch. So I think that's the logic and rationale there. And most people do end up in somewhere in the middle. So
Mhm.
that's both a good and bad news for you, as if you're looking at this and wondering how hard do I need to prep for these. You definitely want to avoid that bottom group. If you're
Yeah.
not comfortable with these tests, you want to just get your score out of the gutter so it doesn't eliminate you from being considered a school. If you're toward the top and you happen to be very mature and um, emotionally intelligent, well, then I think you should learn as much as you can about these tests so that you can make your answers fit what they're looking for, because you have the capability to do that. And that can be the diamond in the rough strategy here.
At least the preview has practice tests with actual answers you can compare your answers to. The Casper, you just get this human who might like your answers or not. It'll be interesting to see if the preview does sort of phase the Casper out over time.
Mm.
Right now, I feel bad for this pool of candidates who have to do both. That's rough. I kind of hope it becomes one thing. I envision a future where the preview will be required by all AMCAS schools, and it'll just be like part of the deal, and then the Casper will go away, because I think they probably don't want it to be a third party if it doesn't have to be. But
Sure.
we'll
So
see.
they want to make the money.
Yeah, that's what
Also,
I'm saying.
yeah, yeah,
That's what I'm
yeah.
saying. Yeah.
Also,
Yeah.
these tests are part of the battle back against AI, which is quickly taking over a
Mhm.
lot of the written portions of the application. So um,
Definitely.
let me finish talking about the strategies here that I think can be helpful if you're going through the preview. So we talked about the gray area, the art of knowing when to escalate. So the idea of when should you try to handle it yourself versus when to escalate. So try to handle it yourself is the default, and you should try to do it in situations that aren't egregious. You should escalate if there's a serious ethical violation that could harm somebody. You should escalate if there's a persistent problematic behavior or situations beyond your expertise or authority, or if there's a power imbalance that prevents direct resolution. So
Mm.
sometimes the most effective approach is like a 1-2 punch, where you try to address it yourself, but you escalate if it doesn't work. So you have to be careful there. But there's going to be varieties of whether to escalate, and sometimes it's very effective to escalate, and sometimes it's very ineffective if you escalate something unnecessarily. So be on the lookout for that pattern in the preview. Um, Timing, when and how you communicate matters a lot. I remember working at the Princeton Review, and we got call from a frustrated customer, and my colleague took it and she started crying on the phone and cursing at the customer. And so right after she got off the call, I walked over to her and said something along the lines of, "How could you have handled that better?" And it was like, oh, dude, like, yeah, sure. She probably already knows she didn't handle it that well. And you're going to tell her now that this, you probably could have handled that better. Like, I was a walking very ineffective at that point. So the whole point here is, yes, you should communicate, but timing matters. And also whether it's private or public matters a lot. So anytime there's a situation involving communication, just be under the idea of like, should you do this publicly or privately? Should you do it immediate, like right now, or a little later? And so almost always, the private should be the default. Only do public if that's if there's something that's like gotta happen right away because it's an urgent flaming threat to someone. And then ditto with immediate versus delayed. In general, the default should be delayed feedback. Immediate would only be if it's absolutely necessary or right now, like because something's gonna be screwed up or cause a problem. Last one for today is just owning your mistakes. So make sure that you admit mistakes. If you do it, try to offer to fix what you've broken, learn from the experience rather than dwelling on it, and then just be as transparent as humanly possible. As you start to take the preview sample test, you'll start to notice some of these patterns coming out, and you'll start to notice them in your own responses. And maybe that'll guide you the next time you're stuck between, well, is this merely ineffective or very ineffective? Any final comments here, Ryan?
These patterns might help you in your normal day life too.
It might make you a better coworker. It might make you a better spouse.